I'm a big fan of it because I feel.
As am I.
Yeah,
Right.
I feel like
it's a tool. There's lots of them. That's one of
yes,
them.
that's part of the reason why I wanted to have you here, so we could gang up on Doug. Let's get him.
I'm not ganging up on him. By the way, RJ,
but sometimes I think people lose sight of that. They think science equals doing stuff in front of a blackboard, but that's not necessarily the case. Science is merely a process to separate fact from fiction, which is exactly what you're doing when you're copywriting, because you're putting.
And the interesting thing is the business obsession with making everything quantifiable and minimizing variance is really driven by instinctive fear of blame.
Mm-hmm.
It's not driven by actually rational thought processes.
Well, because I think what they miss is that by wanting everything to be predictable, you inherently compromise and lose results, right? I mean, it's not possible to have everything be predictable and earn as much money as you would if you leave some doors open, if you live with some ambiguity.
I was looking at
also small business marketers don't get much respect. They all the big ones. I work with a lot of micro-sized companies, 10 employees or less in my classes. And let me tell you, it's way different. Most don't have marketing budgets. So we are doing rudimentary marketing research, trying to help them build.
Our marketing scene is doing marketing a little bit of a disservice in the sense that a lot of the marketing science information, it's so dry, And I'm definitely guilty of doing that. Some of the stuff that I've written, but I think Rory is here, Doug is here, Elmer. Good stuff. I think this is going to be a blast. So yeah,
I'm going to say that article you wrote about sex in marketing is definitely not dry, my friend.
Actually, Rory taught me that stuff. Rory was the first one who started talking. Rory started talking about it. I think maybe as early as 5 years ago, probably even 10 years ago. But I don't know if he published about the difference between effectiveness and efficiency. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that got me thinking along those lines. But anyway,
by the way, with that all said, Tom and Rory, it's really nice to Zoom meet you.
Yeah,
that's awesome. I agree.
I
don't think we've actually all three of us ever.
No, we haven't. Crazy. We must have had 29,000 Twitter exchanges.
Doug, I saw that on your blog, the conflict between that which is important and that which companies perceive as important. That's how you and I met. You sent me that. I commented on it. That was like 2019, I believe.
Right. So, yeah, a few years back there. Yep.
That's when we started connecting. Yep. So.
It is. And I'm getting ready to introduce another group of consumer behavior students to alchemy. So,
my strategy students are
introduced to love it. It's probably one of their top experiences in business school because it talks reality, I mean, not that a lot of business school isn't, but so.
I'm super biased here, but one of the reasons, Rory, why I like your stuff so much is because of your background as a copywriter. I really believe that copywriting is one of the best things you can do when it comes to like marketing creative for a single reason, and that single reason is it forces you to confront reality. Whereas in a lot of literature, you can do studies and you can it's scientific. However, it's you have these ensemble problems where you measure certain things at like an aggregate level. Whereas when you write copy, you have these ideas, but they get like real tested. So it's kind of like the equivalent between and obviously everyone here is evidence based. So there's obviously scientific process and empirical data matters. But it's kind of the equivalent between martial arts pre and post UFC, because there was a lot of intellectualism, where we had like, all of these fake martial arts and intellectually, like all of the stuff seemed sound, and you could make it seem rigorous by, messing up the scientific process essentially. But what you actually needed to do was get people into a cage and then duke it out. But sometimes I think people lose sight of that. They think science equals doing stuff in front of a blackboard, but that's not necessarily the case. Science is merely a process to separate fact from fiction, which is exactly what you're doing when you're copywriting, because you're putting stuff out there and then you see how the market receives. So you have a shorter feedback line. By the way, isn't that what Ogilvy said about?
Yeah. He recommended that anybody in creative, particularly as a copywriter, should spend 4 years in direct marketing.
Exactly.
Because you get high-speed feedback in direct marketing. Mm-hmm. And
exactly.
Also, I think in direct marketing, it uses a completely different vocabulary to behavioral economics, but there is a kind of body of established wisdom.
Yeah.
Start where the consumer is, acknowledge the fact that you're not the most important thing in their entire life, etc.,
Benefits over features.
Get their attention. Yeah,
Exactly.
I teach my students copywriting is the most important skill a marketer possesses. There are modules in my strategy class which they can study to learn. There's a lot of resources. It's so important. And Ogilvy, when I was a senior in high school, this is how I became interested in marketing. I had an elective because a teacher that was there to just graduated from Wharton. And so as a senior, I was reading Confessions of an Ad Man. I was creating ads in Ogilvy style. I did market research. The varsity jacket that they're still wearing was the result of my market strategy, my marketing research project. So I love Ogilvy. And I use direct mail because I'm a digital analog, so I love direct mail as well. It really delivered for me. So,
funnily enough, direct mail and the telephone both deserve a renaissance, because everything has actually effectively, through the general herd mentality of marketers, it's gone so far in one direction as to create an opportunity at the opposite side. And when my kids, who are 20, when they get a bit of direct mail, they don't read their email, by the way, most of the time, or certainly not the ones I send them. But when they get a bit of direct mail, physical direct mail, it's actually pretty exciting. They're quite interested. Because, again, it's that costly signaling thing as well.
Yeah. Well, and it's the empty mailbox. I mean, they stand out now. Whereas, in the peak of direct mail, we were getting 15 or 20 a day and you never saw it. But now the mailbox is mostly empty. And
I mean, in the US in the early 90s, I'd guess, which was when effectively you had lots and lots of digital databases, but there was no digital means of actually communicating to the person. I think heavy catalog buyers in the US, in the run up to Christmas, would effectively be deluged, wouldn't they? You get about 10 catalogs, 10 or 15 a day. Yeah,
it was miserable. I remember the days, and it was just it was this kind of crazy amount of paper coming through the mail.
Insane. And of course, when you look back on it, of course, it was because there was a digital means of actually effectively storing details about your customers. But you only had their physical address. So the only thing you could do with that data was phone them up or write to them.
Right. And there were beginning to be some of the databases around to do some of the matching and kind of clever stuff. But I went through 2 of those programs and ended up coming out of both of those programs and went, we didn't learn anything, because they kind of came back with truisms. The best one was they did a match against zip codes. And they said, well, this product really sells best in these zip codes. And they were the smallest zip codes in the US. And I turned around to the client and said, well, this is lovely. But if you look at the zip codes out of New York, you're selling more product to those zip codes than anywhere. At half of your product goes to those zip codes. So their recommendation wouldn't be to target them, but that's where your product's being bought. So,
Do you guys know Alan Charlesworth? He's in our
Twitter.
Yeah, exactly. He's in our community as well. I had a podcast with him. He's a lecturer in the UK as well, business school. But he focuses mainly on small business. And one of the things that we discussed when we were talking about marketing, what else? When we were talking about moisturizers, but when we were talking about marketing, is the difference between small company marketing and big company marketing. Because I asked him, are you? What do you think about all of the literature that's coming out, etc.? And he was like, honestly, a lot of that stuff is above my pay grade. And I think that's so true, because one of the things that I notice when I'm working on my own company versus working with clients or consulting or whatever, is a lot of the stuff that I do personally is 180 degrees the opposite of what the literature recommends. Because there's the marketing for a small company is so different than marketing for like a Fortune 500 company, because I can do a lot of stuff that bigger companies can't, because it makes no sense. It doesn't scale. So a very simple example of a tactic that is incredibly useful for me personally is using my Twitter the same way how companies use a mailing list. So everyone is always talking about email marketing, etc. And the reason why is because many marketers are lazy and it scales. You have a lot of volume. But for me, what I can do is hit up people individually via DM. Or I can hire people and they can do that, etc. And then you have all of these opportunities that you can take advantage of. And I think Alan, he made a very good remark, which is that most companies are companies like that. So I think it's in mathematics, you always need to stress the domain about when you're talking about something, because things can become true or false depending on the domain. And that's exactly the same thing for marketing as well. And I think sometimes people make the mistake when they don't stress that. So then they say like, this is evidence-based and, this is true, etc. But they leave out that, it doesn't really apply to companies in a certain size or a certain stage. And then people take that information, they apply it, and, they get bad results.
Also, small business marketers don't get much respect. They all the big ones. I work with a lot of micro-size companies, 10 employees or less in my classes. And let me tell you, it is way different. Most don't have marketing budgets. So we are doing rudimentary marketing research, trying to help them build strategies and tactical plans. And it's a lot harder for someone tiny like that, certainly to apply, long and short and all that other, stuff that a bigger company can use.
I wonder if it's not just, I don't know if it's harder, actually. I think it's just different. But I wonder sometimes if a lot of the evidence-based stuff, because a lot of the literature is for like, these huge companies, if it's not actually like counterproductive for some of these smaller brands. Or I shouldn't even say smaller brands. You're not a brand. Like, you have less than.
Well, it is, so much of the literature around brand is based out of Johnson & Johnson. I mean, it's not just big versus small, because it comes out of the consumable goods business.
Yes, exactly.
I happen to like, as much of a cretin as he can sometimes be, I like Bob Lutz, who's written about his time at GM and he's written about how much he felt like GM lost its way when they adopted brand style strategies from Johnson & Johnson, where you can take white cream, put it in a different bottle and sell it for a higher price. But when you've got a car, it's a physical object that has value in it. And you can't just simply rename it and charge more necessarily. You have to do something else. And so most of our brand lessons are out of that consumable goods world. I don't know. I mean, I think, Rory, you'd have ideas out of alchemy about how to make
there are patently different things. So the marketing world changes when you think that the vendor knows who you are, for example. So if you're an airline, for instance, where it isn't just a question of what you think of a brand, it's a question of what you think the brand thinks of you. In terms of treatment, call centers, refund schemes, everything else. Also, it's worth noting that, brand problems, issues are very different in FMCG. In FMCG, you just chuck the thing away and don't buy it again. Okay, right? One of the things that interests me is the amount of wisdom that's probably held in the heads, tacit wisdom, in the minds of call center staff, which we never seek to recover. And one of the things, I was talking to a call center guru the other day who said one of the things they find is that if you have a problem and you solve it well, that old chestnut, actually your customer satisfaction scores are higher than they were before the actual problem occurred. Okay. However, if you have they can cope too with two isolated problems far apart that are reasonably solved. If you have a whole series of nightmares or a spiral of disaster, as in you have a problem, you go to the website doesn't help you with the problem. You then can't find the telephone number on the website. Eventually you find the telephone number and the person doesn't know how to solve your problem. And then they put you through to someone else and you get cut off. Those levels of what you might call poor experience, they're not additive, they multiply. And so I think, I think that's probably fair that FMCG and also B2B, you're right. I mean, B2B is kind of, okay, it's an extreme, it's an outlier, anything which is a service-based business where there's a relationship is a slight outlier. I mean, probably those same Dirichlet rules don't, because all the Byron Sharp data basically comes from packaged goods brands. And, I think things are different. I mean, I think there are people who are disproportionately loyal in businesses where you might argue that the individual sales are not independent of each other. In other words, it's part of a relationship. Not part of a repertoire. I'm not saying, by the way, I'm not saying the same principles won't be found, but I don't think the shape of the curve will be exactly the same. Yeah.
Well, I tend to agree with that. I also worry sometimes that the more we get into pure evidence, it ends up washing out so much of the uniqueness of a situation. And so we've always got this tension, I think, with evidence-based, which is it's really nice to see the averages and see the patterns and see the trends. However, marketing is also about the uniqueness of your situation. I mean, I think that's part of what you're seeing, RJ, in terms of small companies versus big. And big companies kind of have a momentum so that they can survive a mistake of just adopting the best practices. They kind of survive the mistake, and then they're given credit for, well, look, the best practice worked. Whereas in small companies, it's so much more volatile. You can't survive that kind of mistake. And, you have to pay attention to your situation.
Yeah, one of the things that I've also noticed is that there's a huge difference between a company before they have identified all of the moving pieces of the business model versus afterwards. Because if you're still looking for and that's quite uncommon for a lot of quote unquote like traditional marketers, because most traditional marketers they pretty much only deal with companies after the business model. But a lot of guys like me who had their start in like the startup scene, you're basically dealing with the opposite situation, because now also something like product design, it's just way different, because if you learn about product design traditionally, usually it's like a big firm and they try and create a new product, and then it immediately has to launch to a big audience. Versus like, in the startup world where, especially if you're like bootstrapped, or even if you manage to raise, but usually, stuff like that only happens after you got traction. So there's a period of bootstrapping anyway. It's a lot of like ethnography and stuff that doesn't scale as well, where it's like, much more qualitative stuff and much less quantitative stuff. So there are these massive differences. Just the example that
you might also say in the early days of a business, then being too quick off the mark to define your target audience would be a fatal mistake if you're a new business, because the first customers are probably unrepresentative of where the ultimate market lies.
Yeah, but and not just that, also the value proposition, because you might believe that this is the value proposition that I have for these particular people, and first of all, the probability that you guess that right on the first try, even if you've done your research, it's small. It's an iterative process. However, let's suppose that you guessed it correctly. Then the chances that you guessed it correctly and you're communicating it correctly, that now we have a multiplicative situation. There's a small probability in the first one and a small probability in the second one. So it just changes the way that you need to approach marketing. And I think
the biggest thinking about it, the biggest leap forward we can make is the understanding that marketing and innovation are part of the same thing. They're two sides of the same coin. Okay, because you can either work out what people want and find a clever way to make it, or you can work out what you can make and find out a clever way to make people want it. Both of those generate value, and it's senseless to distinguish between the two directions of travel. Okay, but secondly, if you can get the acceptance that marketing done right is a discovery process every bit as much as R&D or NPD is, that actually you do it partly to make money and partly to learn. I mean, Drayton Bird, who is my first boss and still my kind of, one of the sort of 5 big influences on my whole life, I was always surprised when he said, you don't do direct marketing to make money. You first of all do direct marketing to learn. Which, now you've got to remember, he was not a fluffy bunny marketer. He was an absolutely hardcore results focused. I remember him once coming into a meeting and there were a lot of advertisements promoting people joining the RSPB, which is the Royal Society for Protection of Birds. Okay, and they were talking on about how important it was that the RSPB protected birds, and Drayton Bird walked in and said, "You're giving away a free bird table here." He says, "Do an old man a favor, that's your headline, free bird table." Okay, and he was probably right, actually, because you get people to get the free bird table first and they become bird lovers second. Rather than trying to turn people into bird lovers and then giving them a free bird table, probably better to do it the other way around, to be absolutely honest. Okay,
that's pretty funny.
But anyway, he was absolutely hardcore results focused marketer. There was nothing fluffy about him at all. But he said, a very large part of the value of this is that you learn, and the learnings you derive from direct marketing are particularly with something like behavioral science, where you can actually codify it and you can put it into kind of recognizable, a kind of Linnaean framework, okay, Once you can codify what you learn, you can apply it in 7 different places, which aren't necessarily direct marketing. It's just that direct marketing is the quickest and easiest place to learn them. And that actually is why I think we've got digital marketing wrong. We should use digital marketing as the Pathfinder squadron, to use, slightly dubious wartime, but we should use them as the Pathfinder squadron, if you like, not as the actual, the main part of Bomber Command.
I absolutely. I think that's, what I've been thinking all along this discussion here is this thing out of science and complexity of that, that all ecosystems have exploration and exploitation as part of ecosystems, as part of how evolution happens. And that is so true of business, but business school tends to be the exploitation world. And what we miss completely is the exploration.
Yeah, so it says assume you have perfect knowledge, optimize for that is the essential. And by the way, that is, you could argue for any established business, that's probably is and should be 80% of what they do, because you'd be dumb. If you have these random bees whose function is to go off and discover previously unknown sources of pollen and nectar, you'd be pretty silly if you didn't listen to what they told you and exploit it. But at the same time,
you need a small percentage. A small percentage.
But Rory, we have plenty of examples of companies who don't listen to the bees that come back and say, wait a minute, there's a rich source over here. And the company goes, oh no, we're going to keep going back to that flower bed because it's there. And we know it.
We already know the margins. That calorific energy value of nectar collected exceeds collection cost by exactly.
Yeah, but I think then you're getting into Professor Clay Christensen's work, where you become a victim of the previous business model that you've built, and then you find yourself, what's it saying, in between a rock and a hard place, I believe, where you especially if you're big enough, because then it's not just you that you need to convince, but probably an entire board as well.
You know the interesting thing about the innovator's dilemma, which is I think it's actually a psychological dilemma much more than it is an economic dilemma. Because there is always this absolute paranoia, for example, that if you open up a new channel or a new form of pricing, you cannibalize this is the case, I think, which is why no subscription publication will ever offer pay as you go, because they're convinced they'll lose subscribers, the New York Times, etc. Now, actually, in the UK, where the New York Times charges about £1 a month for a subscription, to be honest, the New York Times would make more money charging people 50p an article. There's a limit to what Brits will pay for the New York Times, not because it's not valuable, although you can have a debate about, except when it's covering the UK, in which case it's completely clueless, by the way.
But same with the US.
Same with the US. But it's rather like I won't subscribe to the FT, not necessarily because it isn't worth it, but I feel I'm paying a hell of a lot of money for content that's of no value to me. I'm effectively paying 50% of the subscription to read about the prospects for central banking reform in Ecuador, which don't have much bearing on my life.
Right.
And so one interesting psychological thing, by the way, is if you think it doesn't matter whether something's valuable or not, if you think you're getting worse value out of it than other people, you don't buy it. And it's what I always said about, if you think about it, season tickets on the train. There are people who don't buy season tickets, even though net they would save them money, because they're effectively resentful about the 2 days a week they work from home. And they go, well, the people who travel into London 5 days a week, they're laughing. Here, I'm just at the margin. I'm not going to play, And so in the same way, I think, for example, the terror of mobile phone operators who all had people on subscription, monthly subscription, monthly contract, okay? And the only reason they introduced pay as you go, it wasn't introduced in the US, it wasn't introduced in the UK, it was introduced in South Africa and places where most people were either unbanked or weren't creditworthy enough to get a mobile phone at all. And those people out of desperation said, look, if we stick only with the monthly contract, we're going to end up as a kind of niche, rich guys network. And we actually need to open this up to the mass of the population. So they introduced pay as you go. What you discover is the people on contracts don't leave the contracts. They mostly stay, okay? And actually, bizarrely, quite a few of the people on pay as you go actually spend more than they would if they were on a contract, okay? So quite a lot of that fear of innovating is actually driven by an irrational fear it's not really driven by what consumers actually do.
Okay, so here's the question for you, Rory. Is it a fear of not having it be predictable, right? Because companies want everything to be predictable, and contracts are beautiful because everything becomes predictable. Well, what's our retention rate? How many people are we losing a month? Okay, well, we can factor those in, and then next month's revenues are going to be done. And all of a sudden we have an uncalculable, which we have to say, yeah, we think it's going to work out. But you don't have this ability to say, oh, I did the numbers, it's perfect. And is that a great deal of it, that they lose the predictability?
Well, the irony is, I think, that in all its efforts to be rational, okay, business decision-making is actually not being driven by the prefrontal cortex. It's being driven by the amygdala or the whatever, somewhere, okay, which is the obsession with certainty and the fear of unexpected variance is actually a visceral thing.
Yeah.
In other words, we must do this by the numbers, not really, because is, okay, the quality of rational decision making is not a terrible proxy for quality of decision, but it's by no means an exact proxy. You can have beautifully rational reasons and make a totally dumb decision, and you can have an instinctive decision which leads to a brilliant consequence. Okay, so it's not, there's no reason to think that the quality of your decision making perfectly correlates with quality of outcome. And the interesting thing is the business obsession with making everything quantifiable and minimizing variance is really driven by instinctive fear of blame. It's not driven by actually rational thought processes.
Well, because I think what they miss is that by wanting everything to be predictable, you inherently compromise and lose results. Right. I mean, it's not possible to have everything be predictable and earn as much money as you would if you leave some doors open, if you live with some ambiguity.
I was looking at dog eugenics. Okay, it's not a fashionable subject, but it's interesting. Right. And it occurred to me that you have working dogs, which are selected typically by someone like a shepherd or a cowherd. Okay. And they're selected for a function using a mixture of metrics, which are both numerical, possibly, but mostly subjective. In other words, how well does the dog do the job? Is it loyal? Is it obedient? Is it intelligent, etc.? And that produces fantastic dogs, like the Golden Retriever and the Border Collie and so on. Okay. Right. And then you get show dogs. And show dog breeds are chosen by artificial metrics, like, it's desirable for a pug to have an incredibly short nose. Certain breeds are supposed to have oversized ears, very short tail, etc.
Can we talk about the British Bulldog here? I mean, is that allowed or not?
I don't know whether that's a great dog or an anomaly, because they're actually quite unhealthy, aren't they, typically?
Well, yeah, I have a sister-in-law who's a vet, and I have a brother who he and his two boys, all three of them have bulldogs, and Paige is like, oh my God, they're a vet's dream, because they're, they can't even clip their toenails. They don't give birth. You've got, everything requires go to the vet, and so she's like, they're a vet's dream, but good God, don't buy one.
So I'm intrigued to know how they've been bred, because originally they were actually cow herding animals, but if you look at them from the 18th century, they look very different to the modern bulldog. So I suspect they've been bred for aesthetics. In other words, what happens to be visible, rather than bred for function. Yeah,
you got to admit, they really are good looking.
Oh yeah. No, they're absolutely. Actually, French bulldogs seem to be growing in popularity, and there are also those things like the Rhodesian Ridgeback, which are also a kind of, badass cattle herding dog. But it strikes me that things like the Border Collie that are actually bred around a function, okay, are much, much healthier dogs than those bred around a few metrics. Because
and danger things like some dogs, the big bulbous eyes like a pug and the like. Apparently, they have horrible eye injury problems because they're bred as lap dogs, and so they don't. But if you let them run loose in a forest, they come back with eye problems. And here's my question:
it seems to me quite a lot of businesses are effectively. And the interesting thing about those metrics is in the first or second generations, they may be quite good.
Right.
You see, that actually rational metrics, if you pursue rational metrics for one or two iterations, it's actually beneficial. The problem happens when people game the system, you effectively over optimize at the expense of other immeasurable things. It's, you lose sight of trade-offs.
Well,
my
and
hunch
you lose
is
the
that
people that invented the metric.
Yeah.
So you lose the understanding of its strengths and weaknesses.
Interesting.
Once you're 2 generations down with the metric, all of a sudden the guys that said, all right, we'll use this, but don't ever think about it this way, they're gone. And all of a sudden people are saying, we got this metric, let's run with it.
I feel like we're talking about Goodhart's law, essentially.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's really similar, although I think the sense of understanding a metric's weakness is even above and beyond Goodhart's law, in the sense
that's why
like in a company, you get a whole set of numbers in the database. Actually, my sister's at an insurance company doing data work now, and she said one of their biggest problems is trying to figure out what's the goodness or badness of the data that's in their data lake, because they've lost the people originally connected. She's a actuary, and what she's doing is working with the data people with her skill set, because she does understand the data and the data people don't. So it's that I keep referring her to the Deming quote about applied statistics is 5% statistics and 95% application.
Yeah, I do feel like there's a kind of an argument here along the lines of like the answer to bad science is more good science. And I feel like there's a similar argument here when it comes to a bunch of measures, which turns out to be a proxy of a reasonable approximation, and eventually that breaks down because the whole system is moving essentially. So over time, it becomes less accurate as a function. But I think that's actually an argument for something which you alluded to, which is essentially more of a customer oriented focus, because that automatically ensures that the target is here, and then you design the proxies, aka certain measures, and then you adjust them on a regular basis. I believe actually Professor Bruce Clark wrote about that in his marketing measures lit review from maybe the 2000s or something, where he essentially talked about like pick a few measures and then have a regular interval where you go over them. But that actually reminds me of something, because you and I had an interesting conversation around jobs to be done like a week ago, where you were talking about like the importance of certain terminology.
Yeah, the jobs have been done. I kind of can't get past the term jobs, because inside a company, the term job has this specific meaning. And so inside a company, if I say, well, let's talk about the jobs consumers want to hire our products for, that's a really weird, to me, that's just a really weird way to think about it, because all the implications of the term within the company are not, and maybe we could theorize and get abstract, and it'd be just, and it's fine in those worlds perhaps, but boy, those words are so volatile for us that, when some words just pick up all these additional meanings, and all of a sudden we use them in marketing, and they take us way off into the weeds. And I'm actually continuing a discussion with one of the people from that thread on direct, in direct messaging, that's been pretty deep about, okay, well, where is that? And what are the limits of that? And how wrong are we to use the term?
Is your concern mainly related to like the pedagogy of like, how do you educate people? Or is it like
No, I think that my concern is that as a company, we inherently put boundaries around people. We like to put boundaries around people and say, this is the way people work. And we don't know that. People work in all kinds of ways. The human reality is really fluid. And I've always had some struggle with the term jobs, just because I don't hire products for jobs. I buy a tape measure because I want to, because I'm doing some stuff and I need it around, right? And it's not as specific. So I think, so my concern is that it misleads the team, and that it closes off opportunities for products to be something that more, right?
I get where you're coming from, but and correct me if you think I'm wrong, but to me it's kind of like when you're doing trigonometry and you have like a circle and whatever, and you use pi. Pi is half a circle, So that kind of messes up a lot of your equations, because it becomes like cumbersome. So some people have suggested like we should use tau, because tau is a full circle, and then half a circle is half tau, quarter circle is quarter tau, versus like 3/4 of a circle, that's 3/2 pi. So it's a little bit confusing, but like I feel like that's only something that is valid when you're like learning this stuff, because after a while, when you have pretty much like learned and you're familiar with that stuff, the notation doesn't really matter. And that's like kind of how I feel about like jobs to be done, like as a way of thinking. It's no secret to you probably that I'm a big fan of it, because I feel
as am I.
I feel like
it's a tool. There's lots of them. That's one of them.
Yes, that's part of the reason why I wanted to have you here, so we could gang up on Douglas.
I'm not ganging up on him. By the way, RJ, this is the book. I'll say it's called Marketing Metrics. My friend, Professor Neil Bendle's one of the authors. This is the 4th edition. It's got every metric in the whole wide world. You need the right ones. This is the book for you, and I'll send it to you. And anybody else who wants it, I'll send you a version.
Well, and I think with JobSpeed, I think there is a way that for somebody entering in and beginning to learn, sometimes they need some boundaries around them in order to simply succeed and capture and understand and comprehend an area. I think where I get worried is it gets pitched eventually as the only thing. And one of the parts of this discussion is that, this guy Ulrich has taken it over and tried to make it his thing. And his stuff is incredibly literal. It comes down into a highly effective 61-step process.
Okay, but there is one thing, and I'm not saying this is right, or I'm not condoning this, but the more academically correct almost you want to be, it seems like that directly correlates to the size of your audience, because I feel like there's a degree of hype which is necessary. And again, I'm not saying this is right, but it feels like it's just the way the world is, because you have all these idiots who are very loud, and they're they use that in order. The best example, for example, look at Simon Sinek, which with all of his nonsense around like starting with why, brand purpose, etc. But now he has an audience, and now suppose that he does educate himself, he has a lot of people he can influence now because of that. Whereas if he started from day one and he would say all of the boring stuff, which is absolutely true. Look in our community, like most people have like 7 followers as a figure of speech, so I don't know, there's like a tension there, like obviously don't go so far like always where it's like I have the magic bullet, etc. But there's a degree of hype, it feels like,
there always is a degree of hype. And when I sold supercomputers, we always said never confuse selling with installing. Because if you get off to into installing the computer, you're going to just lose, you don't get, so you have to sell products with some degree of exaggeration. Maybe it's not exaggeration. You have to isolate on the good stuff and not talk as much about the difficult stuff.
I feel like we've come full circle and we're back to copywriting again, because that's essentially like good copywriting. Find the stuff that's sexy and true. Like, because right now it's fashionable to lie, but like copywriting in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, that you weren't lying. You were creative. You were finding the sexy stuff.
And you told the problems. He said, this product has all these problems. Joe Sugarman, the classic, the guy that one of the best over in Atlantic City, New Jersey. Look, let's talk about jobs to be done. I tell my students, McDonald's was not moving milkshake sales. They did all the traditional BS. Brought in Clayton. Clayton's crew just sat in the restaurant for 24 hours recording how many milkshakes were bought. 3-4 days later, they start asking, can I ask you a question? What are you hiring that milkshake to do? What job are you? And secondly, what other things could you hire it? 40% said, I'm hiring this milkshake to make my commute in the morning less boring. As a result of that, they were able to do real things that move sales up. And so that's a benefit of hiring, because they could have hired a donut or a bagel, that they went with the milkshake.
The question though is that any different from what we were doing in the 1980s? Because that's what, this is the world I come out of, which is you just go talk to people. Now, do they hire it? Do they use it? Do they buy it? That's where I get difficult with, okay, all of a sudden we've got a rigid language. The minute we get a rigid language, we eliminate some things. Instead of hiring it, maybe somebody doesn't even think about it that way. It's just really more, oh, tell me about the milkshake. Why'd you buy that? I mean, this is what has been done in research for, since 100 years ago, when kind of the first serious dedicated market research happened. So it's really it's just about talking to people about it. So it's like I get caught on jobs to be done, because that absolutely I'm with it. Where I get difficult is when it becomes a more rigid process, that's when it gets dicey, because all of a sudden you're eliminating avenues. I have a good friend who used it they applied it in their company, and he came back to me and said, yeah, what we found is it's really good for the incremental improvements we make, but it has been absolutely worthless in trying to find step change, trying to find really serious new things. And I think that's the reality of that limitation, right? That if you're trying to, what's the quote from, I use from the Organization Man, that it used to be the way science happened is when it was written up, the scientists would say, well, I was in the lab and I knocked over some sulfuric acid and I saw this thing happen. That's how we discover stuff. And so anything that gets too rigid in focus loses the ability for, our elbow to hit that bottle of sulfuric acid.
But I feel like this is exactly like MMA. To go back to the MMA example I gave earlier, because you can pretty much say all of these you can give the same arguments for fighting. MMA is restrictive and all of these arm bars and jabs and crosses, etc. But they are tools. It's the same with mathematics, and 100% you're correct, because if you have people who are trained in mathematics and everyone goes through the same systems, then sometimes you have people who are trained in a different country where they approach something differently, or maybe they skipped ahead in mathematics because they learned something by themselves, and that gives them a unique insight. So so there's definitely an argument to be made for like a little bit of wastage. Because like you said, otherwise you get stuck on incremental innovations, because you're always talking to the consumer, and trying to figure out, okay, what am I hiring you for, etc. What are you hiring the product for?
Because back to what Rory observed, I mean, my experience with products is that there are two ways that people come at it. One is from the point of view, what do people want? And the other is from the way of, this is what I can make. And what we have to do is be in the middle of both of those, so that when we're out talking to people, we have a sense of what can be made, because it's only when those two come together that you have something valuable. So we can't just go talk to people, I did have one guy tell me that, a guy I worked for, he was an engineer, and he said, oh no, I just make what I want to make and they'll have to buy it. And says, do you really want to hear what they say? I'm like, yeah, I really do. I really do want to hear what they have to say. But question for you, Tom. You've been more deeply in the business school world, I think, than either Rory or I, which we both come from these renegade direct marketing backgrounds. It's always a little... I'm not sure Portland State is still comfortable with that fact. What do you take on? What's your take on some of this with this balance, especially kind of more like this exploration and exploitation, where the business school strengths are, but we also, like in small companies, run into these challenges? Kind of a vague question, but
I think Rory had mentioned this. One of the biggest problems in marketing to me is we have to attribute everything to an ROI for everything we do. Companies don't experiment. There is none of that. And let's talk about CMOs. They get shit canned first.
Yeah.
And now's the time of the year. The company's looking at the results. Oh, we're not doing well. Who's going to be blamed? The CMO, the sales. The CEO starts going in the background and starts pushing the CMO up. Boom, and they get kicked out. I tell my students, don't work for a company the CEO doesn't believe in marketing. And there's too many of those companies. And the other thing is, every company has a different idea of what marketing is. And so what we teach in business school, or what I teach, is the holistic view. In basic marketing, we start introducing all students to the same class you teach. In global marketing, I teach that cut in ways to how you do that internationally. And then in the marketing management capstone I teach, primarily that's the main course I teach. We talk about bringing it in the real world, doing marketing in my classroom, working with real clients, running through a simulation that's 8 quarters long, where I even signed RJ up. I want my students doing marketing, and they hear the whole truth about it. I'm the only professor that teaches that way, I believe, because I come from a practitioner's point of view.
I want to
30 years doing it.
I want to bring up one point that I want to get you guys' opinion on. Okay, so obviously, I always say obviously, I should really avoid that because a lot of this stuff isn't obvious. But there is a degree of benefit to randomness for the reasons that we've just discussed so far. However, one problem that I think, which is a valid concern, which someone can raise, is why not then just grab a random person off the street, because that's the most random. So that's what I mean when I compare it to MMA or mathematics. You need a degree of structure, and I feel like a lot of these problems, you can resolve them you resolve bad science by adding more good science. So you can resolve this by having more models. So, jobs to be done, it isn't perfect. It leaves some holes, and then you try and fix it with ethnography, and you go to customers that still leave some holes, and then you add a little bit of quantitative marketing to the mix, and you start analyzing big data that leaves some holes, yada, yada, yada. Because otherwise, I feel like you open up this can of worms where it's like, let's just grab anyone, and then if there's no ROI, the MMA equivalent, you're doing a bunch of stuff but you're not winning fights, then at what point do you say, okay, clearly this isn't working? So there needs to be at a point, and then obviously field M&As, long and short, etc. You need a certain period of time, but there needs to be a certain period of time, whether it's a year or 5 years, where you say, okay, you don't know what you're doing. So like, how do you resolve that tension there?
I don't think you resolve it. You live with it, right? I mean, and I don't mean it's, I don't mean that quite as flip as it sounds, but you start focusing, and you get pieces that help you focus and learn bits, but you always have to keep in your mind the reality that focusing leaves stuff out. So you have to be moving back and forth between, okay, I got this bit of information, that's great, but wait a minute, what's the total picture here? And then, I found some other stuff out of the data lake. Oh, that's really interesting, but then you pull back and say, but does that really affect the overall? Like with that client I mentioned earlier, where we found out that the data information would have told, if they'd interpreted it the way they wanted to, told them the exact opposite of what was making their business big. And so, you kind of have to, you're moving at all these levels. It's like with, one of the things I'm writing about with complexity is that when you succeed with the complex, you don't do it by focusing on just the big issues, because you succeed with focusing on the details, but the details that matter, not every detail. And so there's this whole challenge of figuring out what are the details that matter, and how do you focus on those while also keeping the big picture in mind? And I think companies hate that, because that's a duality, and we like to focus on one thing. Well, I got this big strategic idea, or it's all about executing. Well, no, it's about both. And that's what's particularly hard.
Rory, where are you with this? Like, how do you address this? You are big on not being too rigid, leaving room for illogical ideas. What's the balance here?
Well, the reason for that is that, as with scientific discovery, and the general fact is, I tipped this thing over and I noticed this weird thing. A surprising number of, as I've said, of kind of billion-dollar new businesses didn't make sense ahead of time. Okay, I don't think Five Guys did. I don't think Nespresso did. I don't think Dyson did. I don't think Red Bull did. And so, essentially, the idea that you should attempt to innovate through what you might call inductive logic strikes me as a fundamental mistake, because I don't think research will tell you what's going to be a breakthrough product fully, because everything new seems fundamentally weird to begin. I mean, Coca-Cola, I never quite understand why Coke is so popular in Britain, because if you'd asked me in sort of 1940, we want you to launch Coca-Cola in Britain, I go, look, it's a tea drinking country. You can't get ice to save your life. Okay. The climate's shit. Okay. And also everybody's drunk. So the need for a non-alcoholic drink isn't actually that great. And yet Coca-Cola does not quite as well as it does in the US. It does pretty well here.
Well, Rory, you pointed out Red Bull. I mean, that stuff tastes like garbage. You know, you talk about who'd ever think of that one?
And there may be a weird thing, actually, that nearly all new drinks, if you look at them, and that's even true of Pepsi and Coke, they start off as medicinal. And you get people over the hump of unfamiliarity by claiming it's good for you. And then eventually they become acclimatized to the taste. So that's, but tea and coffee were sold as medicinal products when they first came to England, for example. Now that's an interesting pattern. You know, that has an interesting pattern, effectively, which you might want to exploit some other way. And it also explains, I think, why weird things like miso soup, which are Japanese, if miso soup wasn't known to be a traditional Japanese soup, no one would touch the stuff, right? You know, what's this leaf doing in this peculiar...
That's alchemy right there.
It's right there, you know.
It's alchemy.
And so what we've got to do is just get comfortable with the fact that, I mean, also true of a huge number of successful chocolate products and confectionery products have basically emerged because of an accident in the chocolate factory. Okay, I mean, literally, a bit of machine goes, some bit of machinery goes haywire, and people discover that the resulting mess is actually delicious.
So should there be like a percentage of your I don't know, where it's like 5% of our marketing budget, or that might be a bit excessive, but like a percentage goes to just weird ideas and experimentation?
There is this notion of 70-20-10, which I occasionally come across. And 70% of it is pure exploit. 20% is attempting to expand on what you already have, extrapolating from existing knowledge. And 10% of it is, now the important thing about that is if you ring fence and cookie jar the budget to begin with, you don't have that problem that you look like a worse marketer in the short term because some of your experiments fail. Okay, so I think it's a fundamental mistake to effectively. Now, one of the problems that happens, of course, you all know the story with Daniel Kahneman and going to the board of directors of a kind of Fortune 500 company. I've always got the vague idea it's GE, though I may have been wrong. And he goes to the heads of the various departments, divisions, and says, if I can offer you a bet which gives you a 50% chance of a 50% increase in profits next year, but I think it's a 20% chance or 30% chance of a 30% fall in profits next year, would you take those odds? And all but two of them say, not a chance, because 20% of the time I'd lose my job. And by the way, if I take those odds 3 times in a year, 3 times in a row, I'm pretty much bound to lose my job. Okay.
Yeah. Asymmetric risk reward.
Asymmetric risk reward. And yet the chief executive sits at the end of the table and says, but I want all of you to take those risks because net, we're going to end up a hell of a lot more profitable every year. Okay. Now, the interesting thing is that when you effectively push financial responsibility down the organization into silos, you create a risk aversion in the overall organization, which is far worse than it should be. Part of the reason why large organizations exist is that it's kind of, you need to accumulate to speculate. You know, when you are successful enough as an organization, you have got a margin of error, which allows you to make mistakes occasionally. You know, something that would wipe out an entrepreneur in year 1, you know, you can survive for 2 years, and of course there are network goods which might require 3 or 4 years of losses before they deliver at all, because until you reach critical mass, you know, it doesn't work. And in those cases, I think it is fundamentally problematic that effectively a successful business is deemed to be a business where everybody is individually successful. And actually, a really successful business is probably one where 80% of the time people are incrementally successful, 20% of the time, you know, they're kind of 70% successful, and 10% of the time they engage in what you might call high risk outliers. You know, they do, you know, they, in other words, they just change the rules.
Well,
it's kind of like how to.
I was going to say, in some part of the time, they're muddling around in a way. You know, I just read this, I wrote about this article by Mintzberg where he looked at Volkswagen's strategy, and that's fundamentally said that in the late 60s, Volkswagen had a muddled strategy. They didn't really know what they were doing. It was, you know, which violates all the what you should do strategically stuff. And yet that was the period of time when they figured out the outing. So when they hit the early 70s, they actually hit a really effective strategy and took off from there. But they needed that muddled. And that's, I think the part of the problem in companies is we don't allow ourselves to muddle. And we got to figure out how to do that politically, because obviously that's death within a corporation. But somehow people need time to go, I don't know the answer. Let me think about it. Let me try some things. Let me run my head against the walls.
This also has parallels with what John Kay says about creativity, which is there was a famous experimenter, British guy, who experimented on creativity. And he went and found 10 really creative architects, and he went and found 10 architects who are generally perceived to be pretty workaday and average. He didn't tell them that. He didn't say, you've been recommended to this experiment because everybody says you're a totally drab and awful architect. And they all have their idiosyncrasies and their differences. But the one thing that was absolutely common was that the creative architects tended to muddle around with the problem, happily coexisting with a state of ambiguity for quite a long period, whereas the uncreative architects effectively just wanted to get down to, they wanted to eliminate ambiguity from kind of day two. Mm-hmm. And it was the people who, and John Kay says, of the creative process, a necessary part of it looks to the outside like time wasting. Mm-hmm. But in reality, the reason you play fast and loose with deadlines, if you're a creative person, is you're waiting to get lucky. Either new information will emerge, because the longer you take before you close down all avenues, mm-hmm. If you can wait 10 days before you close down all avenues while writing an ad, interesting new information may emerge. Yeah. John Hegarty famously, I think, was on a factory tour of the Audi factory. And he sort of shufties around looking at various things at the factory, and the account people are going, come on, John, what on earth are you doing? What are you staring at that stupid old sign for? We're supposed to be in an important meeting. And John just says, what does voorsprong durch technique mean? Which in the UK, for about 15 to 20 years, became the end line for Audi, precisely to establish that Audi was German rather than what everybody assumed was like Italian or Swiss or something. You see, and it was to establish the Germanic credentials of Audi, but essentially, I think the creative person knows it's a probabilistic process, and you've just got it isn't that, but it's not even a process. You've got to maximize the chance of getting lucky. You've got to maximize your exposure to possible upside opportunity.
You're not baking the loaf of bread.
Exactly, and the deterministic person wants to turn it into a methodology. And to be honest, of course, the reason ad agencies have a process is largely, since they became paid by the hour, it was necessary to satisfy procurement that you knew what you were doing with every hour of time, and that every hour of time moved you closer to the goal. Of course, this is total nonsense.
Right.
Okay.
Nothing angers me more than when I had a few clients that came back and said, I know we're paying you this money to manage this whole campaign. And well, how's it doing? Well, it's doing great. We're just rocking and rolling. People are really happy. But can you tell us exactly how you're spending every hour you're billing us for? I'm like, oh Lord.
But
really?
that's an entrepreneurial mistake, because you're essentially trading your time for money, which is ever since value-based pricing is what, like the 90s or something, or late 80s. So it's kind of like if you have expertise in marketing, then honestly you shouldn't really make such a mistake, because you have expertise, so you should know
have
about
expertise.
That.
Well, the expertise is about learning and exploring. I mean, that's the funny thing about it is expertise isn't that we know how to get the right answer every time. Expertise is that we know how to set up conditions so that we end at the right answer. I mean, that's the reality that we have to work with, is a lot of times we don't know what the right answers are until we get going. I used to frustrate clients because I'd go in and on the first meeting, I would not give them the creative idea, right? Whereas I know a lot of my competitors would go into the meeting and say, oh, well, that's your product. Okay, well, what we ought to do is this. And I refused to do that. And, I would lose those jobs, but they're great to lose because I didn't want to work for those people that needed that. I was going to say one formal term to introduce for Rory's idea about creativity is, my wife is a visual artist, and I have very good friends who are visual artists, and they all do what they call procrastinate. which is this period of time when they, well, yeah, I should be working on that big piece, but I kind of want to sew a couple books together, or I want to do a little dyeing over here, or I got this really cool new pen. It's really, it is pretty funny because that's very productive time for him. And I love that idea of procrastinating.
Well, Cleese makes exactly the same point. He says you've just got to accept that if you start to look at eating and say that it's very efficient as a process when I'm bringing the food and the fork to my mouth, but it's completely inefficient when I'm returning the fork to the plate. Okay. You will see eating as only 50% efficient. You need to look at procrastinating as part of the overall process.
Right.
The necessary part, because to some extent, creativity is the art of distracting yourself.
Actually,
so that your unconscious can actually get a look in.
Yeah, that reminds me of one. I'm just going to take this gratuitous point on focus group work, that one of the criticisms of focus groups is that, well, you waste a lot of time because these people are all in there. You've got 8 people together, and so you're only getting 1/8. So let's see, 2 hours, 1/8, 15, you're getting 5 minutes each or something like that. But what strikes me is it's like, no, because the difficulty sometimes in a one-on-one interview is you have no time to think. So even with the 4 of us, Rory says something or Tom says something, and I'm sitting here thinking, wow, that's interesting. But what do okay, but that goes over here. But in a one-on-one interview, you kind of keep the cycle going where you never have that opportunity to let things connect inside of you to discover something new. This applying the efficiency theory is misapplied all the time. But
it's also why science isn't done via debates. Because because of this reason, you need time to digest, etc. And as a good speaker, you can bamboozle the audience by wit, even though you're wrong objectively.
Cynic.
But, yes.
What Rory said about Haggerty is very true. You don't want to ask the question because you'll appear stupid. He shared an example of I think it was a subway or a train station. They said, what is this here for? Well, they didn't need it. So that, again, so many people are afraid to ask the stupid question.
Actually, that was famous in the high-speed train. What are buffers for between carriages? You need them for shunting. Are we going to shunt these carriages? No. Well, then you don't need them. Yeah, absolutely.
Students will not respond.
How's that going to work for you?
Yeah, students don't respond. Anybody have any questions? I'm now using, okay, before I move on, somebody has, what do you got? What do you need clarity on? You just got to encourage them to talk.
I introduced my marketing management course with the reality is you cannot efficiency yourself to success. So let's get that out of the way right now. What you've got to figure out is efficiency is important. It has a big role to play in success, but it doesn't get you to success.
It assumes that you already know the path.
Yeah. And what you need to do. So our job in marketing is to find things that are valuable to people and find ways to sell them and find ways to recommend what the company, change what the company does so that we're more effective in the market. And, that's our role in marketing is all the stuff about what happens in the market and the value that we deliver and all of those things. And it's, it's kind of a shocker to them because a lot of my students are coming out of the finance program and, they have that deer in the headlights look like, uh-oh, what am I doing in this class? And of course, at the same time, I'm having to justify why they all have to take the class because it's a requirement in the business school. It's the only topical requirement in the business school is that you have to take marketing management. And so
I like that. That's a good business school.
Yeah, that's what I love that thing. And they get it when I say, look, here's the scoop. This is all about success in the company. So that's what we're trying to do, and you need to know it.
Yeah, I teach marketing management as well. And again, there's the business strategy. And in my class, we talk the business strategy, the marketing strategy. They belong. And I believe in a marketing management class because it's about customers. Retaining and finding and retaining customers is why businesses exist, in my mind.
Yeah.
I think actually, and I wonder. By the way, go ahead.
Is there a problem there that most data actually within companies is now produced for shareholder consumption, and it's a completely different form of data?
Oh, I hadn't thought about that. Well, I'm adding that to my list, Rory, because I'm building a huge list of all the problems that came out of the shareholder value.
Yeah. Well, it's fascinating. John Kay, the British economist, read his book Obliquity if you haven't read it.
Oh,
that is
I haven't read it all yet. I started.
Yeah, that's effectively an attack on the shareholder value movement. And it's an absolutely stupid attempt to remove ambiguity at the price of nuance.
Yeah, this feels like what we were talking about earlier, when you have a profit orientation versus a customer orientation. Because there's a short-term versus long-term point of view that you can take, essentially. But real quickly, it's 7 p.m. At my place, so we're an hour in. Originally, I had planned to hard cap it at an hour, but I'm having a blast. Like, what do you guys want to do? Do you want to?
Well, let's make an hour 10, an hour 15, because I mean it becomes unworkable if it's longer than that.
Yeah, people won't watch.
Yeah.
That sounds good. And I have a 7:30 your time podcast.
I'm going to stop and get a very quick drink as well.
That's a good idea. I should get a drink myself. I'm going to get a beer.
Cool. Let me just pause.
Got my water. It's still before noon out here.
I can actually use this opportunity to discuss something with you. Yeah. Where do you stand with respect to positioning? Because there are a few different takes. There's the marketing science take of positioning. And then, there's more of the startup take with respect to positioning. Well, what's your reasoning process around that?
It's complicated.
Just filling Tom in really quickly.
Yeah.
I asked him with positioning, there's like two different takes on positioning. You have the marketing science take on positioning, where it's like you don't entirely get to determine the set of brands that you're competing with, yada yada yada. And then there's the startup world, where it's like no, actually positioning it actually does matters, because you alter the way in which customers frame you. So that's what I asked of Doug.
I really love positioning at the level. I mean, first of all, if you use it to get a sense of where do I fit for my customers, which is where the Trout and Ries position approach in their original book, and then rewritten to try to make money in 2 other books. But
Dave Trout also listed as one of the most influential books he ever read.
Yeah, it's really very potent, the idea that your product fits somewhere, and some of their fundamental communication rules, like what's the tallest mountain in the world, Everest, what's the second? Well, it's K2 if you're a climber type, but otherwise you kind of don't know much, I think that there's a lot of value in it when you look at it that way. But what's very hard, I find, to teach is that it's about where you exist in the customer mind. Because companies want to position it as a directive, top down, kind of linear thing where it's projected out from the customer. So if we take positioning and we're talking about where do people put it in their mind, like 7-Up is the Uncola, or those kinds of things, it can really be quite potent. And then you can, I tell them, all right, the process is you figure out where you might exist in people's minds, and then you figure out how to communicate to help strengthen that. Right. Or play or, leverage that. And that can be really potent. I mean, I had a client made a drill bit sharpener. We positioned them as the drill bit sharpener. There was one competitor and they sucked. And so we just said,
was it a small business or like a huge brand?
They were in between. They were about 100 million a year, 150 million a year. And
I wonder positioning. If positioning isn't something which you need to again analyze with respect to a certain domain, because I think positioning, especially for like early stage companies, is something which is much or April Dunford, actually, who talks a lot about positioning, she makes a distinction between a considered product versus a non-considered product. So that's how she like divides it up, where it's like a non-considered product is something like chewing gum or all of the FMCG stuff. And a considered product is something like, you're a CMO and you need to buy, I don't know, marketing research, and it's going to be a massive amount of money and you can't get it wrong. And I think once you take that into account, I suspect, although I don't have like empirical evidence to back it up, that you do see differences, because empirically, from my own experience and the companies that I've worked with, mainly like in the startup scene and friends and whatnot, I've seen how positioning can actually be influential, and mainly because, especially because you can change the way a product is framed. So it's kind of like what Rory says, like you can make people want it, make something people want, or you have something and you find a clever way to make people want it. And I think that's something that you see in startups a lot, where you want to figure out, what do people want and can I make it? However, there's also a degree of like, I have this thing and the product is actually objectively good, but I haven't communicated it in a way, or I haven't framed it correctly. And then you're leaving that work to be done on part of the customer. And it is work, it is cognitive work. So you can reduce that friction by doing that for the consumer or for the customer, user, whatever the product is. And then it's like, hey, we are this and we belong in this category, which means you need to compare us with these alternatives. And I think in that sense,
I'll give you a very interesting two examples. Two great examples of interesting positioning are the naming of Beyond Meat and the Dutch company, the Vegetarian Butcher, who says, if you don't like meat, don't buy my products. And so every single sort of plant-based food always used the language of kind of self-denial. And, what was missing was the important thing.
Right.
And they've kind of used the language of kind of high confidence that it's kind of meatier than meat itself.
Better for you.
And the other interesting one, I think, is the way in which design was used to make Coke Zero the cokiest Coke. So the red and black now, I'm not sure whether this was intentional or not, but you can understand with tax on sugared drinks, etc., you actually want people to shift from classic Coke to Coke Zero without actually getting rid of classic Coke. And the interesting thing is the way they've designed the bottles now probably means that classic people will heavily migrate over to Zero.
We have.
Yeah, you have. Interesting, isn't it? Isn't it interesting?
Yeah, I love it. But there are Dunford's book is excellent. Have you discovered the positioning advantage by the professor at Virginia, Kimberley Whittier? If you haven't, it's a must read. It's brilliant. She was a pracademic, worked at P&G, and it's just a great tool to build a positioning statement advantage. And also my buddy Yuli Applebaum just came out with the brand positioning workbook. Again, for my small clients, I'm going to say this is where you start. It's full of exercises. This is how I think of positioning. Ever play the game Battleship, where your ship is hidden, and you're attacking your enemies out there in the marketplace? What's the position we can own? Ries and Trout was a great book. It helped us open our eyes to it, but the Kimberley's book really is a rigorous academic and practical approach.
I do think when it comes to stuff like this, like water, for example, all that stuff starts to become less important, because I think
I'm not sure though, because if you take water, the bottle styles and stuff, there's a whole part of the water business that's about which is the one I drink when I want to be treating myself, or, those kinds of things that are, I think we're late, and perhaps it's getting too cluttered. I mean, the beer market in the US for craft beers has now come down to titles. If you can have the craziest title, then you win the shelf space.
But don't you think a lot of that stuff can be explained away by like physical availability and salience?
A bit, but I think what's hard is this stuff all mixes. I mean, I guess that's what's really tough is positioning isn't a thing in and of itself. Positioning relates to your communication. It relates to your bottle. It relates to your strategy.
Your pricing, obviously,
It's up there. Segmentation, targeting, positioning. It's up there before you get to the 4 Ps.
I think, yes, you're right. And so I'm not sure I'd say that positioning is the way to get there. I think sometimes we can end up at success from a bunch of different directions, sometimes from positioning, sometimes from a salesman out in the market that's listening well and kind of doing market research as they go along. There's a lot of different paths that we can follow to into success. Right. And sometimes I think positioning is one effective one. But it does require, the mistake I see in positioning are people who refuse to live with ambiguity, right? Or refuse to, want to, figure it out too fast. I did a project. My favorite positioning story is a project I did with AAA of California. That's the automobile club. If you belong, they tow your car for free, things like that. And we were working with their automobile insurance, and they were out trying to figure out what position they should be. And they were reviewing all these things like, well, if you have an accident, we forgive you once, or, we have student discounts or things like this. And they kept sending me transcripts from focus groups. In the transcript of the focus groups, I'm reading. I'm like, no, you guys got this all wrong. The position is you're the car insurance from AAA. because people have all this value they have associated with AAA. So quit making it so complicated. That's the one absolutely ownable position, and it's meaningful to people. So let's not sort out all these other things. You're the car insurance from AAA.
So your argument is that by dint of being AAA, you've done all the work in advance to make yourself a credible insurance company. So don't then start building from the ground up again. Yeah.
Oh, let's go start an insurance company. We got to go back and start from scratch. No, you use your brand, and the ad we ended up doing for him was tremendously successful. One of the San Francisco agencies tried to create one to replace it, and they fought for 3 or 4 years before they were able to get an ad to produce well. Because we just embraced it's AAA. What's our job? To get you on the road again. So, you have an accident, we'll get you on the road again. You need to get towed, we'll get you on the road again, Anyway, I'm rambling there. What are you thinking there, RJ? You're kind of...
Yeah, no, I think you made a lot of interesting points. This actually reminded me of something when I was talking about small business marketing with Alan Charlesworth. He made such a good point that really stuck in my head, where he was talking about, we were talking about a lot of these more abstract ideas, or bigger company marketing when it becomes a little bit more nuanced and whatnot. And he said something along the lines of for a small company, essentially the thing that makes you I shouldn't say unique, but for lack of a better word, unique is your mixture of the 4 Ps, which I thought was spot on. Because you have a certain price, you have a certain place, and for example, place in and of itself can already change a decision that the customer or the consumer will make. So if you have for example, a cinema, which is in the city, the city center, and you go with your wife, you're in the city, and you're at a restaurant, and the cinema is you cross the street and you're there. Or, one is out of the city, which also has different advantages, because now you can take your car and you go from your house straight into the parking garage, and, you're right there. So I think that mixture is, for some reason, all of this talking about positioning reminded me of him saying that. I thought it was very interesting.
Well, and I think that's the thing. Marketing is such a thing of the whole. It's how it all comes together. I teach about pricing, that price is communication. That gets everything a little bit wonky, because companies like to think it's just a number.
That's what Rory always says. And it's really true. It's one of the reasons that the product that I have, I have a 12-week boot camp, which is for bootstrappers who are at zero, or they're at maybe a few $1,000s a month or whatever, but they want to do it better. They want to improve it, the profit. So it's a 12-week boot camp, which is very hands-on, very intensive, and it's a lot of it is basic stuff to us, which is essentially you start with the ethnography and you work your way, you find out the pain points, etc. You use that to make a product, versus a lot of the stuff that's mainstream in the bootstrapper scene, where it's you make a product in isolation, and then you have something, and then it's where can I find my customers? Who's the product made for? I have no idea. Now you don't need a marketer, you need a wizard. so that's the boot camp. And then I have another product as well, which is an introduction to entrepreneurial science. It's a 6-month program, very in-depth.
Wow.
Statistics, game theory, social psychology, a little bit of cognitive psychology, different things. But they are priced very high. And that is already a signal of quality. And if I would price it very low, then it would be suspicious, because then it's you doubt the quality because the price is low. And I actually experimented with that, because I was curious. I as a marketer, you need to test stuff. But I had this idea, and I was let me put it to the test. So I tweaked the price for a period of time in the beginning, and almost no change in conversion. If anything lower. so that tells you something. That
Keep
tells
it up.
you that, but you wouldn't expect that if you would plot a simple demand curve. Then it's price goes down, demand goes up, quantity demand.
Well, I'm sure you use social proof of happy people that have been through the course and have raved about the success.
Yeah,
that's the key.
I can do that now, but initially I couldn't do that. But
now you have that.
Yeah, but then you use
So that-
other social proof.
Yeah, so that works your flywheel. More, I see people are signing up. You're showing sold. So that's awesome.
Yeah.
Brand curve. That's a really good point. The demand curve is a really good example where going mathematics forces, in that case, it forces us to abstract so much that it leaves out so many things, because it isn't really a curve that smooths like that. It depends on all kinds of things. And so as an idea, it's fine. It makes sense. And, in this, on the other hand, it's left behind. I mean, it's again, the kind of myth breaking I have to do in that fundamental starting marketing course is, if it's cheaper, do you inherently sell more? And, can you mass produce to where the cost of the product is zero? Well, no. So that means you have a bottom limit. There is a bottom limit on what mass production and scale can do for you. And
it's and also something
kind of doesn't include that really.
Yeah, and I think something people don't consider enough. Obviously, if you're even like slightly sophisticated, this is super obvious. But I think a lot of people forget that when you discount and when you lower the price, that comes from your profit, because your cost of goods sold, they'll remain the same. So it's incredibly expensive, depending on the margins. If you're like doing stuff in the real world versus like, selling bits and atoms and ones and zeros, or like knowledge and education and stuff where the margins are higher. But if you're doing stuff in the real world and you have a certain margin and you lower the price by like 10%, that can have a serious impact.
Well, you got to sell an awful lot to get back to zero. I mean, get back to the beginning point.
Exactly.
You're hurting yourself.
Yeah. All right. I think this is a good place to wrap it up. Professor Elmer, Professor Garnett, Teach. I had an absolute
It was
blast.
awesome. It was very much fun. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thanks for pulling this together, RJ.
If anybody wants to marketing, you see that Marketing Prof Tom Elmer, that's my YouTube station. You could see the crazy videos I shot in my class. You could see the special speaker series. I recommend, if you want to learn some more, check out, the kindness of so many.
And I was just online checking out, it's in the UK at least, it's called, it's Kimberley Whittler's book is called Positioning for Advantage.
That's it. That's the book.
That's the one. That's the book. I was just checking on that. I'll have a look at that now.
There's some great podcasts. You could hear her. She does a marketing book podcast.
Have you read Alex Hormoz's book, The $100 Million Offers?
I have not.
That'll interest you. That's really, really good. Okay, it's a fascinating, he's actually more hardcore on the behavioral science side and the kind of irrationality side than I am. So it's quite impressive. He actually argues that in pricing, you often need the sting of a high price to give the product meaning and salience.
That's good.
Kind of interesting.
Yeah.
Well, this has been fun.
Yeah, I want to sneak in one super quick question to Rory. Okay, listen, Teach. There's this moisturizer that my wife always buys, and it's something like $30 or whatever. But like almost every month, it's from Olas, I think it's pronounced. I don't know.
Olay.
Olay, yeah, maybe.
Olay, yeah, Olay.
Yeah, P&G thing, yeah.
Yeah, whatever, Dutch, English. But every other month, it's discounted 50%. So that means that pretty much whenever you want to buy it, you can get it in a discount. And what I'm curious about is like, there's no difference on your P&L or whatever, versus like having a consistent low price or a higher price that you then discount. It's equal. But what I'm wondering is like, do you think that that'll impact sales, where it's like, this is actually, you're getting a $30 product for $50?
It's similar clever price discrimination to the McDonald's wrap of the day, where if you're price sensitive, you sacrifice 3 times out of 4 your favored flavor to save yourself £1. But if you're basically loaded or you're celebrating a lottery win, then you pay £1 extra to get the flavor you want.
Oh, okay. So there might be.
But I mean, there is an interesting thing, which is if you think about luxury fashion brands, one thing you could claim is that some of them burn their goods. At the very high end, they actually burn unsold goods because they don't discount. But most of them, and that's this is something you can investigate. It seems nuts, doesn't it? But most of the time, having a product which you can sell to quite a lot of people at full price, but which you can still sell profitably at 50% off or 2 for 1, is a pretty nice position to be in, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because with high-end fashion goods, bluntly, actually, there's probably, you go all the way to your premium store on Fifth Avenue, then you have, obviously you have the outlet malls, okay? You have sales. Ultimately, it goes then down to TK Maxx and eBay, okay? Mm-hmm. But somewhere down there, you're going to make a profitable sale.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I mean, it is worth noting that, and he also makes the very good point that there is no strategic advantage to being the second cheapest in the marketplace, whereas there is an advantage to being the most expensive.
Yeah,
good point.
And then there's the marketing science literature about like discounting, and where it's like, discounting, it doesn't really seem to attract new customers. You're mainly discounting to people who would have bought you anyways. Yeah. And the argument that you're training your consumers to buy you at a discount. But I think your argument was actually quite interesting, Rory, where it's like, a few people might wait it out, but then there are people who are like, yeah, I value my convenience more, so I'll buy it anyway. So maybe
what probably happens with your wife, what probably happens with your wife is when she's got a half of a tub left, she'll take advantage of the 50% off offer, which then means the purchase gets brought forward. And if she actually ran out, she'd pay full price. That's roughly what I'd guess.
Yeah,
so you're creating extra moments of purchase, you see, as well, aren't you?
I need to study her like a subject.
Exactly. No. I mean, the other interesting finding is that I always wanted to do an experiment which was completely illegal, obviously, and you couldn't do it because it'd be unethical and illegal.
Which we don't have an ethics board in marketing.
No, but it was to put 50% extra free on a product and then put the price up by 50%. Okay. I just want to see, are people actually buying on price or are they buying on a deal? Because they're not the same thing, right? Anyway, I mentioned this one day and a guy said, we already know the result to that. I mean, we already know the answer to that. I said, well, how do you know the answer to that? You can't do that. He said, because I won't name the brand, obviously, because we've done it by mistake. Okay, a couple of times by mistake, we put 50% extra free on a big bar and somebody forgot to twiddle the bloody price point and it ended up being charged. And they said, you basically sell just as much as you do. You keep the price the same.
I think that's why. I think the reason why is because no one knows what like this stuff costs.
I think we micro obsess about price.
Yeah.
We micro obsess about price when consumer to the customer it's a lot more fluid. It kind of washes out up here. A lot of behavioral stuff like what Rory's talking about. And yet within companies, it's like, yeah, but what if it's $24.98 as opposed to $24? Actually, I had a guy come back on a TV. We did a TV spot and it didn't do well. In fact, it sucked. Right. The direct response was horrible because of the product is what we learned later and where it fit into the customer's buy cycle. So we redid it with a much more focus on retail, still with a direct call, and it worked. But this first time it just sucked. It did horrible. And the guy from the media buyer came back and said, well, we've done a lot of testing. You offered it at $19.99. It'd be a lot more successful at $19.97.
That's not the problem.
5 times as many sales. Are you trying to tell me that a 2% drop? I mean, I could believe that 1997 sounds more unique. Maybe it's a little more memorable. I mean, I could argue a lot of things around that difference, but none of them are 4 times sales.
I've talked to pricing experts, by the way, on whether you have round dollar pricing, whether you have 99, 95, 97, etc.
Right.
And they say it's a fascinating thing. It makes a big difference, but you have to test because we've never found any hard and fast rules as to when to apply which.
Right.
Wow.
In other words, it seems to make a big difference, and it's emphatically worth testing.
Right.
But at the same time, they've never been able to generalize a rule.
Mm-hmm.
In how brands grow. I apologize. We'll wrap it up here. In how brands grow, Professor Byron Sharp talks about like the pricing, how people compare it to the consideration set. So that might explain why it's not there's not a fixed $9.99 because it depends on the category that you're buying in that particular instance.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it depends on, in these commercials we did, if we didn't give meaning to the product, price, nobody would bother. And if we gave enough meaning to a product, the difference between 97 and 99 wouldn't matter in that context.
Oh, that's a really
good in a retail context, it's a whole different thing. And, so it all depends on context and what's around it. Yeah, I'm going to have to head out here. I have something coming up in a couple minutes.
We're going to wrap it up here.
This has been tremendous fun.
It's been fun.
This has been
Likewise.
absolutely awesome.
We'll
Thanks,
do it
everyone.
again.
I'm gonna make sure that I'll put all the book links down below. Doug, is there anything you want to share very quickly to listeners or watchers, your website or something?
Well, yeah, my website is douggarnett.com. And I've also started doing podcasts every other week with Shaheen Khan, where we spend 20 minutes and just go over a few quick topics. And hopefully
What's the name?
People find them kind of interesting. What's that?
What's the name?
It's Shaheen Khan, is a good friend of mine. He was VP of Strategy for Sun Microsystems. And we're just calling it the Marketing Podcast. When you go to douggarnett.com, it's in the top bar. You can get to it. So.
Yeah, I've listened to them. There's some good ones.
Yeah.
All right. Rory, you just launched a new course.
Absolutely.
Where can we find it at?
Mad Masters. If you search for mad/masters and Rory Sutherland, you'll find all the details. And it's kicking off I think it's in May. But there's plenty of time to sign up with an early bird discount, I hasten.
Nice. There you go. Good pricing.
There you go.
Your 42 course, I'm a student in all of them, and I've loved all those 42 courses you've done, Rory, as well as our friend Richard Schotten. So
he's great. Wonderful
dangerous.
Guy. Absolutely fantastic. Thanks, everybody. Have a good next meeting, folks, too.
Thanks so much. Take care, everyone.
All right.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.